You know, when we think about addiction, we usually picture this lonely individual battle, right? But what if that's just half the picture? What if addiction is less about the person and way more about their relationships? Okay, let's really get into this.
It's the age-old question, isn't it? Choice or disease? But what if the answer is way more complicated than that? What if it's not just rooted in our brain chemistry or our willpower, but in the very connections or disconnections we have with other people?
This quote just nails it. It flips the whole script. It suggests that the substance use, that's not the actual problem. It's a symptom, a cry for help in response to some really deep relational pain.
So the first big idea to wrap our heads around is how substances become an escape hatch. I mean, when our relationships are causing us pain, it's a totally human instinct to look for the nearest exit.
I mean, think about it. Constant fighting, feeling like nobody has your back, feeling totally invisible. Those dynamics just grind you down. They chip away at your sense of self-worth and create this constant storm of stress, fear, and anxiety. Of course, people are going to look for some kind of relief.
And there's actually a name for this, the self-medication hypothesis. The idea is that it's not always about chasing a high. A lot of the time, it's about trying to silence a low, using something, anything, to just numb the sadness or quiet the anxiety that a toxic relationship churns up every single day.
Let's make this real. Take the Hastings family. So you have Lisa, a nurse who's completely overwhelmed and feels utterly alone. Her husband, Tom, is just not there, emotionally or physically. The pressure of her job, of being a mom, it all becomes too much. So she starts using substances, not to get wild, but just to cope, to escape that crushing weight of isolation.
And this is where it gets even more complex. It's not always about numbing out. Sometimes, substance use offers a temporary escape into feeling. When your relationship feels like a cage, that moment of intoxication can create this powerful, even if it's fake, sense of freedom and passion. It's a chance to feel alive again, even for a little while.
Now, this idea of escaping pain, well, it takes on a much, much darker shade when the relationship itself is built on a foundation of trauma. The connection between abuse, neglect, and addiction is just undeniable.
You can actually map out this heartbreakingly common path. It so often starts with what's called an adverse childhood experience, or an ACE. To deal with that incredible pain, a person develops coping skills that, well, they might seem to work for a bit, but they're ultimately destructive. And over time, that coping mechanism can slowly morph into a full-blown substance use disorder.
And we are talking about incredibly damaging events here. Things like emotional or physical abuse, seeing violence in your own home, or the profound instability that comes from parents separating. These things leave deep, deep wounds.
And what's so critical to understand is that this isn't just a psychological thing, it's biological. Trauma can literally change the physical structure and chemistry of a developing brain. It basically rewires the brain's stress and reward systems, making it way more vulnerable to addiction down the road.
Okay, so let's zoom out a bit, because addiction is almost never a one-person show. It usually exists inside this really complex family system that often, without anyone even realizing it, is actually working to keep the addiction going.
The key idea here is something called homeostasis. Basically, every family tries to find a state of balance. But in a family struggling with addiction, that balance can be incredibly toxic. The system might, on some unconscious level, decide that dealing with the addiction, the devil they know, is actually easier than facing the chaos that would come from talking about the real issues, like a broken marriage or some hidden abuse.
And this whole system is often held together by really unhealthy boundaries. You've got two extremes. On one side, rigid boundaries, where everyone's on their own little island, totally isolated and unable to talk about feelings. And on the other, you've got diffuse boundaries, where everyone's so tangled up in each other's business. We call that enmeshment, that nobody knows where one person's needs end and another's begin. Both create the perfect breeding ground for addiction.
And if the system is an engine, enabling is the gasoline that keeps it running. It's things like making excuses to their boss, paying their rent when they can't, or literally cleaning up their messes. And it usually comes from a place of love, or just a desperate need to keep the peace. But what it really does is shield them from the natural consequences of their actions, which just makes it easier for the addiction to continue.
And to manage all this chaos, people tend to fall into these really predictable roles. You've got the hero, the overachiever who's desperate to prove the family is okay. There's the scapegoat who acts out and gets all the blame and often develops their own substance issues. And then you have the quiet, lost child who just tries to be invisible.
Each one is a survival strategy, but when you put them all together, they just lock this broken system into place.
All right, let's zoom out one last time beyond the family to our friends and our social circles. Because whether we like it or not, behavior, especially this kind of behavior, is contagious.
There's a pretty simple psychological principle for this: social learning theory. At its core, it just means we learn how to act by watching the people around us. We see it, we copy it, and we make it our own, especially if it's someone we look up to.
And you see this play out everywhere. A kid watches their parents pour a drink every single night to de-stress, and what do they learn? Alcohol is how adults handle stress. Or maybe a new relationship or friend group makes it clear that drinking or using is just what we do here. When our entire social world treats substance use as normal or even as a requirement for belonging, it's incredibly hard to resist.
So when you start putting all these pieces together, the emotional pain, the trauma, those family systems, the social pressure, you start to see addiction in a totally different light. It's not just an individual failing, it's a deeply, deeply relational disease. Here's the bottom line. Addiction thrives in disconnection. It's a vicious cycle. The pain from broken relationships leads to substance use, which then causes more relational problems, which creates even more pain. And this tangled web of trauma, family roles, and learned habits can feel absolutely impossible to break free from.
And this is so important when we talk about recovery. Those same unhealthy relationships don't just magically disappear. A big fight with a partner, feeling pressured by old friends, or falling back into those old family dynamics, these are massive triggers for relapse because they tap right back into the original pain that the person was trying to escape in the first place.
Which brings us to a final and maybe the most important question of all. If disconnection is the poison, could connection be the antidote? If broken relationships can help create an addiction, is it possible that building strong, supportive, healthy relationships might just be the most powerful medicine there is?